Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Trish Muir. I'm the chair of the Pima Area Labor Federation. I want to let everybody know, give you an introduction to our organization if you're not familiar. The Pima Area Labor Federation is Southern Arizona's body of the AFL-CIO. It's a democratic federation of 55 national and international labor unions across the private and public sectors with more than 12.5 million members. We work to transform the lives of working people, pushing bold structural change and advancing the causes of economic, social, and racial justice for working families in our community every day. When it comes to the fights of our time, worker safety in a global pandemic, economic security, meaningful public investment, the demand for racial justice, the battle for our very democracy, the Koch Brothers and their well-funded, scrupulously plotted network driven by profit at the expense of everyday people has wreaked havoc across our society for more than a generation. The effects of their anti-worker agenda continue to deprive working families of basic rights and needs for the sake of greed. At our core, unions organize to build worker power and level the playing field with powerful employers and their corporate interests. The Kochs and their elaborate network have diligently positioned themselves to undermine our ability to build and maintain that worker power at every turn. Creating shell organizations and funding deceptive astroturf movements disguised as grassroots and well-meaning advocacy efforts solely to tighten the grip of corporate influence. If we are to tip the scales back in favor of workers, we must begin the work of dismantling what the Kochs have so meticulously built. We can't effectively fight an enemy if we can't identify it in all its forms. If we want to invest in public education, public health, public infrastructure, and a robust social safety net, if we want a government that prioritizes public need instead of corporate greed, we have to educate working class people about the forces actively keeping them down both on the job and in everyday life. To build a force capable of combating the highest levels of corporate greed, we must grasp the problem at its root. We believe that the work begins on the factory floor, and that's why we're happy to team up with Kochs Off Campus to bring you this webinar titled Uncoach My Workplace. First, I'd like to introduce Jeff Holson from Kochs Off Campus.
Hi, Trish. I'm Jeff Holson. I'm Vice President of AFM Local 33 here in Tucson, and I'm a co-founder of Kochs Off Campus. I'm reading my prepared remarks. This is not the first time PALF and KOC have collaborated. We did recently work with PALF to organize a very highly visible standout event on National Koch Busters Day, along with PALF and KOC. Postal workers, Red for Ed, Veterans for Peace, Jobs with Justice, Represent Us, Arizona Progressive Movement, Tucson Peace Center, and others were involved. We, at a prior point to that, hosted a community forum at the AFGE called The People of Arizona versus the Koch Empire. It was a very successful forum. We are reaching out and trying to educate people. We have a history of doing this. We've conducted and attended multiple other forums, tabling events, etc., and worked to make the Koch issue more widely known in every way possible. I'll have more about Kochs Off Campus later in the webinar. Right now, I'd like to introduce CJ Jones from JWJ, Jobs with Justice, who will talk about the Koch organization and what makes it such a formidable and dangerous enemy. CJ, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this webinar, and thank you, Trish, for inviting me to do this. The first thing I want to say is that I'm not really an expert on the Koch brothers. What I've done is take a look at a couple of books, try to prepare a brief overview of who they are, what their goals are, and how they operate to achieve those goals. The more I find out about the Koch operation, the more convinced I am that their story should be shared as widely as possible. After the last election, I kept asking myself, how could 75 million people, what you might call average Americans, have voted for Donald Trump. And I think that a good part of the answer is that these 75 million people, they know they've been shafted by the system, so to speak. Things for them are not as good as they used to be, and their lives and futures are not what they had come to expect. But they don't really know how that happened. They don't know who spoiled their dreams or how it was done. And in their anger and confusion, they blame the wrong causes and end up voting for the likes of Trump. So I think a broad public understanding about who the Kochs are, what they're doing, is an important step in getting voters to redirect their anger to the proper targets so they can support candidates who hopefully can help us straighten things out. So in addition to talking about the Kochs, how the Kochs have affected the unions, what I want to do today is contribute what I can to people's understanding of the Koch operation, or as some call that operation, the Coctopus, which for those who don't know what a Coctopus is, we have a picture of that beast. Do you have that slide, Trish, that you can put up? I think it's coming. All right, that's the Coctopus. Let me just leave that up for a couple of minutes. So I looked at several books in getting ready for this. The most interesting book I found was in reading about the Kochs was one written by an investigative journalist, Jane Meyer. The name of her book is Dark Money. It has sold over 800,000 copies. So the story about the Kochs is getting out there. I also heard Jane Meyer speak on a webinar last week where she made some comments about the recent political events. To give you an idea how significant she thinks the Koch brothers are, I want to relay a couple of things that she said about last month's storming of the Capitol and the fact that the former president has actually had the audacity to even try to steal the presidential election. The question, she says, how did the United States of America, the country that holds itself up as the example to the rest of the world on how a country should be run, how have we come to such a place? And her answer is that a small group of extraordinarily wealthy, radical, free market advocates, they've used their fortunes to impose their minority viewpoint on the rest of the country. And she identified Charles and David Koch as this group's most important leaders. And even though they didn't support Trump in 2016, Meyer says they prepared the way for him. So their movement has spread a hatred of government, a distrust of the truth, and economic despair for millions of Americans. They deregulated the financial markets, which allowed a rise in economic inequality that has not been seen in this country since the 1920s. They destroyed curbs on business, such as protections for labor unions that have been in place since the 1930s. They flooded the American politics with money. They've been able to undermine the public's trust in experts, and they've destroyed their belief in the mainstream media. So in that webinar, she also went on to remind us that even though David Koch died last year and Charles Koch is 85 years old, the toxic conditions that they have created still do and will continue to rile American politics. So who were those guys? Who were the Kochs? First, I want to talk a little bit about the man who started the Koch enterprise, the father of the Koch brothers, Fred Koch. So Fred was born in 1900 in the Texas-Oklahoma oil field area. His father owned a small town newspaper. Fred graduated from college eventually as a chemical engineer, an oil engineer really, and he developed an innovative way of refining crude oil into gasoline. Eventually, he ran a very successful oil industry business in Wichita, Kansas. But later in life, Fred became a strong anti-government, anti-communist activist. He was a founding member of the John Birch Society. He wrote anti-communist pamphlets and distributed them himself by mail order. He also subscribed to various far-fetched conspiracy theories, such that President Eisenhower was a communist agent, that blacks were about to start a race war, and various other John Bircher nonsense, really. In his personal life, he had 4 sons, including, of course, Charles and David, who eventually became the infamous Koch brothers. He was a tough, demanding father who passed on his right-wing ideas to his kids. So as they say, I guess they came by their conservative viewpoints honestly. But for brevity in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk mostly about Charles, the second son, born in 1935. Charles is certainly the main character in the Koch story, and just talking about him will get the picture of what was really going on. So as I said before, Charles grew up under a tough, demanding, disciplinarian father who did instill his philosophy in his kids. When the kids were growing up, there was a lot of competition amongst the brothers, and Charles eventually became kind of the dominant son. Supposedly, his favorite game was King of the Hill, which when they played, he usually won. So after he graduated from high school, Charles went to college at MIT, where he got master's degrees in both nuclear and chemical engineering. He eventually came back to Wichita to work in his father's firm. Ideologically, Charles mostly accepted his father's conservative ideas, but he did reject the more outlandish stuff. He did join the John Birch Society. He was very conservative. He developed what he called a passionate commitment to liberty. And the liberty that he meant was that liberty espoused by the Libertarian Party. In 1967, Fred Koch died. Charles took over as the CEO of Koch Industries. He was smart, hardworking, ruthless, strongly anti-union, willing to cheat if he could get away with it. And Koch Industries under Charles did well. Always an integral part of the Koch business strategy was a virulent anti-communism. I want to give one example of a battle they engaged in shortly after Charles took over as the CEO. So that was, we'll call that the War for Pine Bend. So through a series of clever negotiations, shortly after he became CEO, Charles got complete control of a refinery that Koch Enterprises had previously only had partial ownership of. The Pine Bend refinery, named for its location in Pine Bend, Minnesota, processed crude oil from Canada. Because at the time, the government rules that protected domestic oil producers, imports of cheap foreign oil were limited. So for some arcane reasons, Pine Bend had an exception to those import restrictions. So the company actually had a tremendous potential for profits, except for the union. So the unions in Pine Bend had been organized into unions since the 1950s. The union was deeply entrenched and powerful. The union set the rules in Pine Bend, the work rules, to the point where the unions actually set the wages. And in the late 1960s, most CEOs of corporations considered powerful unions just to be a fact of life. The New Deal through the Wagner Act had given the union strong protections, so most companies chose to accommodate rather than to fight organized labor. Charles, however, chose to fight. What he did is bring in a brand new plant superintendent who laid down new work rules, and he refused to negotiate with the union. Eventually, the union went on strike, setting up round-the-clock pickets, and all truck traffic that supplied the plant were staffed by Teamsters. All that traffic came to a halt. Even police officers who were also Teamsters didn't cross the picket lines. Minnesota was a union area. In order to keep the refinery running, though, the superintendent brought in workers from Texas and Oklahoma, and since they were unable to cross the picket line, they used helicopters to get them into the plant. After some weeks, there were some scabs, non-union truckers who tried to cross the picket lines. The strikers threw nail-encrusted balls under the tires. They even jerked drivers out of their trucks if they tried to cross the line. Things were getting more and more violent, and just outside the gate, including people who heard gunshots. So eventually, the Kochs got a restraining order limiting the union authority. It so happened at that plant, there were railroad tracks leading into the refinery. They had previously been used to haul material in and out. Union members knew how to operate the trains. In the middle of one night, in about the third month of the strike, unknown persons sent an unmanned diesel engine towards the refinery, which was staffed around the clock with about 300 supervisory staff and scab laborers. But just before the engine crashed into the refining towers, which have caused the entire plant to explode, the engine was turned over by what they call a derailleur device. A derailleur is often a thing they put on unused rail lines to prevent a runaway train from causing harm. Anyhow, it tipped the engine over, which laid there all night. No one was actually killed by the engine, and the perpetrators were never identified. So after this incident, Charles Koch himself came to Pine Bend, and he ultimately decided to continue the battle despite the potentially fatal consequences. 6 months into the strike, with national fuel shortages looming, that was in about 1973 or so, the negotiations between the union and the management escalated, and the head of the union and the Koch people were actually meeting in the Department of Labor offices in Washington, D.C. However, they could not reach an agreement. The strike continued. So eventually, after about a year, some of the other unions who had originally completely supported the strike had started giving concessions to the management. And these betrayals weakened the position of the union. Finally, after 17 months, the union voted to end the strike and accept the new work rules. So afterwards, the Pine Bend refinery remained unionized, but the strike had really broken the union's power. So the result of this fit into a pattern that subsequently was playing out across the United States. And it was Charles Koch's victory, which he savored. The Pine Bend refinery became probably, they call it the cash cow of Koch Industries. It was very profitable and made Charles Koch even more anti-union than he had been before. So I want to talk a little bit about the rise of corporate power at that time. So in spite of this singular victory by the Kochs in the late 1960s and the early 70s, there were actually very daunting times for corporations. The Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969 had jump-started the environmental protection in the environmental movement. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, accused corporations of putting profit ahead of human life. It was a very popular book. Unions were tough opponents for management. Students were marching in the streets. There was a passage of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA. There were accusations that corporations were unduly profiting from the Vietnam War and more. So corporations, felt like they were under attack. One notable reaction to this anti-corporate feeling of the day was a project that was undertaken by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They commissioned a Richmond, Virginia tobacco lawyer to devise a plan of action for business. And that lawyer, Lewis Powell, wrote what was a counter-revolutionary call to arms for corporations. He claimed that the very existence of business was at stake if they didn't get politically organized and fight back. So Charles Koch was one of those corporate CEOs that accepted this call to arm. And using his money, his business acumen, his organization and management skills, he joined the battle and became one of the most effective agents in this war to reassert business control of the country. So what did they do? So early on, the Koch set up and funded a think tank called the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute, in existence now since 1980, has been the nation's premier think tank for libertarian philosophy. And through the years, the Kochs have donated millions of dollars to 30 or 40 or more conservative political groups. In 1980, David Koch ran for the office of vice president on the Libertarian ticket. The Libertarians were running to the right of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who they considered too liberal. And their platform which embodied the libertarian philosophy of the Koch brothers, called for the elimination of the post office, the elimination of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They opposed all income and corporate taxes. They called for the end of prosecuting tax evaders. They also called for the abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency, the FBI, and the CIA. Might not have been all bad. They demanded the abolition of the minimum wage and child labor laws. They targeted public schools for abolition, along with what they call compulsory education for children. They wanted to get rid of the Food and Drug Act, OSHA, seatbelt laws, and all forms of welfare for the poor. In short, the Libertarian Party wanted the government to be reduced to a skeletal function. That is, government should only be used for the protection of individual and property rights. So David and the Libertarians actually did not do well in that election, but that campaign had the effect of changing the Koch brothers' perspective away from striving for political office to a focus on changing the institutions that affect public policy. Another strategy the Kochs have employed throughout was to donate money to educational institutions, which Jeff will talk about a little bit later. They've given millions of dollars to over 350 colleges and universities in attempts to burnish their image, really, and also to recruit students to conservative thinking. Also, David Koch in particular, in trying to look good, burnish his image, he has made what might be called large greenwashing donations. He's given a lot of money to nonprofit foundations, art organizations, et cetera, in New York City. He's also contributed heavily to PBS, and you see his name on, or at least you did see his name on programs, pretty regularly. So another major project for the Kochs has been to organize other corporations and rich people to donate money and join their crusades, really, by conducting these semi-annual meetings, or seminars as they call them, in various high-end resort hotels throughout the country. And over the years, they've raised well over $1 billion, probably a lot more than that, which they use for their various conservative causes. In 2012 alone, they spent over $800 million on the elections throughout the country, which rivaled or even surpassed that spent by the Republican Party. They were also, at the same time, able to expand their own business dramatically, increasing their wealth, allowing them to exert even more control. So the wealth of the two brothers in 2019 was said to be over $120 billion, which puts them among the richest people on the planet. So although the things that the Kochs have personally done were certainly significant, a more important way they have affected policy in the United States is through their creation of and or the funding of a set of overlapping organizations that work together to affect policy change. So the most important of these organizations, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the State Policy Network, and the Americans for Prosperity. So the American Legislative Exchange Council is a business association funded by various corporations, including, of course, the Kochs. The organization writes model legislation that corporations want to get passed and then encourages state legislators to introduce bills they have written in their home state legislatures. One reason this system works well is because many state legislatures are inexperienced, they have very little staff, not much money, so they often welcome any kind of help they can get in writing bills, and if their bills get passed, they think that makes them look good. So ALEC operates throughout the country, and on average produces about 1,000 new bills a year, and they say about 200 of them become law each year. The second organization, the State Policy Network, is an association of over 60 state-level think tanks. They operate by crafting proposals for legislation, staging public events in support of their proposals, and issuing policy statements. Some affiliates, like the Goldwater Institute here in Arizona, also engage in legal work in support of conservative issues. The third group in this triangle, called the Americans for Prosperity, is an astroturf or a fake grassroots organization that supports, that organizes supporters to stage rallies, write, call, visit elected officials, contact the media, etc. They also run television, print, radio ads supporting issues and candidates as part of political campaigns. And the Americans for Prosperity has activated probably between 2 and 3 million grassroots volunteers in all 50 states of the country. So a somewhat simplified explanation of the strategy of the three groups working together is that the state policy networks originate ideas for laws. The American Legislative Exchange Council writes the legislation, gets state lawmakers to introduce them to their legislatures, and the Americans for Prosperity with their volunteers hits the streets and the airwaves and the mailboxes, trying to create the illusion that regular people are behind their conservative ideas. So what effect have the Kochs had on unions in particular? Like I said, they've always targeted unions. Recently, they supported that lawsuit that resulted in the so-called Janus decision, which ruled that public sector unions could not require non-union members to contribute to union activities, even though they benefited from them. They've been able to get right-to-work laws passed in 13 states. They've gotten laws passed that prohibit collective bargaining for anything other than wages. That prevents unions, for example, from bargaining for things like health insurance, pensions, worker training, promotion rules, or dismissal procedures. They have been able to hinder unions from automatically collecting dues. For example, some of the effect they've had in Wisconsin, after several anti-union laws were passed, union membership fell in that state from 50% in 2011 to 19% in 2017. Also, campaign contributions by, for example, one union, the teachers in that state, their contributions to state and local elections have fallen by 70% in that same period. So other success the Kochs can claim that affect the entire country are allowing more corporate money into political campaigns, lowering taxes for corporations and the rich, suppressing voting, especially by marginalized voters, cutting environmental regulations, protecting fossil fuel interests, reducing government spending on many social programs, and at least partially privatizing many state agencies such as public education. And it's not over yet. It's worth noting that the institutions that the Kochs have created are still out there doing exactly what the Kochs wanted them to do. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about what they and their allies are trying to do right here in the Veterans Administration and in the Postal Service. So in conclusion, I want to show one slide that shows what the financial effects the Kochs and their ilk have had on American workers since the Powell Memo was written about 50 years ago. So what this graph shows, if you can see it clearly, the line increasingly going up to the right is the increase in the productivity of the American economy as a whole. And if you can see it, about 1973, the other line, which shows average worker salary, goes up with the increase in productivity until about 1973, and then it more or less flatlines, showing that while American productivity as a whole went up, wages, in fact, did not. So while they're not entirely to blame, there were other factors involved, but the Kochs and their partners have been significant contributors to the reduction of average workers' income. And a recent RAND Corporation study says that if income had followed productivity gain for the last 50 years, the average worker income, which is now about $50,000 a year, would be about $92,000. So it's no wonder people are mad. So that's basically what I have to say about the Koch brothers. But just to make what my position clear, I want to give two quotes I'd like to share. One is by Warren Buffett, who of course is one of the world's billionaires. What he said one time is that there is a class war going on and we're winning it. And the other quote is from Noam Chomsky. And he says, if there is a class war and only one side is fighting, it's pretty easy to see who's going to win. So that's basically what I have to say. If you do want more information, we might be able to get a list of that up somehow, get that to people. And I think Trish is going to take care of that. So I think I'll just let it go at that. And Jeff is now going to talk a little bit more about the Kochs Off Campus.
Just a little bit, CJ, that was incredible. Now I have no idea what I'm going to say in the tails of that, except there are some specifics about Kochs Off Campus that I do want to get into later. I can tell you a little bit about our group, our community group here in Tucson. The Kochtopus, you can think of, this isn't prepared, I'm winging it right now, is you can think of it as a giant octopus, right? It has tentacles everywhere, right? We're in Tucson, Arizona, and our work started with Tucson, with here. What are the Kochs doing specifically? Where is the tentacle reaching here? And so now I can go to my remark. We, Kochs Off Campus, are a grassroots group of Tucson residents, UA faculty, alumni, and students who are working to get the University of Arizona to end its connection to the Center for the Philosophy of Freedom, or Freedom Center. More about that later. The center also created an entire department on campus, which is in essence competing with existing departments to promulgate this same philosophy and advance the causes of the Koch Network, the Department of Political Economy and Moral Sciences. KOC, Kochs Off Campus, came into existence in 2017 when 3 community members, I'm among them, I'm an alumni, learned that the UA was housing a libertarian think tank that was created with the backing of the Koch machine and its allies. Ultimately, this included the Arizona legislature creating this think tank. At that time, we learned that the university intended to move, this is sort of how we got rolling, they intended to move the history department from its office space to create room for this think tank. As a matter of fact, there was some talk that a number of professors were simply disgruntled because they were being relocated, which was absolutely not the case. I can clearly and unequivocally state. But it is kind of ironic that this think tank is moving into the history department space to engage in its work of rewriting economic and political history, which is what this think tank, part of its mission, is to do. The more we learned about the Freedom Center, its agenda, its high school and undergraduate dual enrollment course, and how it conducted itself, the more we saw how dangerous, devious, and underhanded they were, and how inappropriate it was for our university, which is a public university after all, to have any association with them. After 4 years of this work, we now see at Kochs Off Campus the necessity to build a campaign to uncoke our state of Arizona, which we are working to do. I will have more remarks about Kochs Off Campus, our work, and more detail about what this center is engaged in doing here in Tucson later, but I would like the presentation to roll on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ and Jeff. Fantastic information, fellas. I think it's there's a lot happening kind of under the surface that people don't know about. So thank you for bringing that to us today. And to kind of talk a little bit more, CJ, did you have for us a little bit of conversation about what that's meant and how they've moved towards the VA?
Yes.
Okay, if you could.
I have a little information about that.
Great, thank you.
Actually, I'm going to talk about how the Kochs work at the national level to try and privatize the Veterans Administration, the healthcare system. So the Kochs have attacked the veterans in their typical secretive ways by funding existing organizations, creating new ones with deceptive names that work in interlocking ways with the aim of discrediting the VA, reducing the services it provides to discredit them, and to eventually try and privatize the whole agency. Because of their secretive ways, it's hard to say exactly how much, but they have dumped millions and millions of dollars into political campaigns for politicians that support their views, and they fund their campaign, and they fund campaigns against their opponents. For example, they spent over $100,000 on an ad opposing Hillary Clinton after she had rejected some criticisms of the VA. So the most prominent organization that Kochs have created to work on their plan is called the Concerned Veterans of America. And on their website, the Concerned Veterans of America says it's a group of veterans from every branch of the uniformed services and in every conflict from World War II to the global war on terror, and that their mission is to advocate for policies that will preserve freedom and prosperity. But the CVA, as they're known as, they've been called one of the most muscular arms of the conservative Koch Network. And it's recognized by legitimate veteran organizations as the Koch's AstroTurf organization working on veterans affairs. So CVA and other Koch organizations have been successful in placing many of their operatives in what's called the revolving door employment, where their people move from positions in their nonprofits into government positions such as the VA administration and various other jobs where they can affect VA policy. They lobby, they try to ingratiate themselves with VA officials. They exchange personal emails, have social contacts with them, and basically try to affect VA policy in any way they can. So CVA says reforming and fixing the VA is a top priority of the organization. Their solution is to what they call give veterans a choice of care providers, which is, of course, is a step towards privatization. So one veteran advocacy group says about the CVA, whether it is their plan to privatize the Department of Veteran Affairs or to move military retirement to a private 401k type system, Concerned Veterans of America are opposed to policy for which virtually every major veterans group fights. So that's at least partially what the Kochs are doing at the national level. And now Joe is going to talk a little bit more about how these things are playing out on the ground.
Hey, good evening and afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Diggs. I'm from the American Federation of Government Employees, supervisory national organizer. So I've been with AFGE for 24 years, and I came over from the private sector. One of the most amazing things that I found when I came here was the level of, well, basically how much money actually goes into the policy decisions made by the government. Like many people, I had an assumption that everything was on a fair and up, and that as a private sector union member, I was only really having these kinds of issues with my employers at a private level. But once I got involved working with the federal government, I started to see the really terrible undue influence that money has on our political system, and that the government is sometimes viewed as a ham. It's free money that's forcibly collected from the citizenry through policy and privatization decisions can be taken, that your wealth, your taxes can be taken and then given to private interests. The Koch Brothers and the Concerned Veterans of America are the arm of this movement. They sell their ideas on these kinds of concepts. Oh, the VA is terrible. Oh, would it be better if you could go outside? And they promise the veterans all of this stuff. And, sometimes the VA can be a little difficult to get through, not because of the work of our folks, but because of the policies that are drawn up and written up that help make it less than efficient than it should be. And the fact that it's as efficient and as popular amongst our veterans overall as it is almost a miracle, given the fact that as we speak today, there are 49,000 vacancies at the VA. This is not unintentional. This is on purpose. The idea behind these folks is to slow down disrupt, or disable federal agencies in their delivery of services and goods, to undermine the confidence of the public in these groups, so that they can then come in with their shill operations, like the Concerned Veterans of America and other little, what do you call them, AstroTurfs, brother, AstroTurf agents who come along pretending that they're grassroots angry, but in reality are just a front for these folks who have a definite capital wealth concern. They could care less about the veteran. One of the, a few years ago, we had the horrible waitlist scandal at Phoenix. And this has gone on for, this kind of behavior has gone on for a while. The only reason this thing came to an end is our employees spoke up about it. At great risk, some people even lost their jobs as a result of it. But the goal there was always to starve the agencies of the things that they need to do to complete their missions, then point their fingers at the same agencies, claim incompetence, claim everything under the sun, and then try to build support for the privatization of these different agencies. And that's because in our political cycle, unfortunately, money plays too big of a role. And so it's very easy, especially when we had Citizens United, where now you've taken the caps off of how much money people can give to parties and particular politicians. And it's almost like a money investment. I spend $600,000 here, I get a contract worth $7 million there. It's a great return on investment, and they don't really care what happens to the veteran. So our union, who represents as the largest federal union in the country and the largest, by far the largest union representing employees within the VA system, have always fought them tooth and nail. We fight them in the way that the only way that people without money can fight in this kind of a system, which is why this webinar is so timely, and really even more timely after the last election. Elections are not determined by how much money you raise or how much money you spend. They are determined by how many votes are cast. So in actuality, every one of the citizens in our city, in our state, in our country have the ability and have the most powerful thing that you can have in a democracy, which is your vote, to control what it is they want to see done with their tax dollars. Because I don't want to sound like a libertarian here, but the fact of the matter is you have to pay your taxes. You have no choice but to pay your taxes. And if the government is going to take my taxes, then I should have something to say about how it's done, not 3 people or 4 people, rich people sitting in a room and dividing it up. And to that end, in 2018, there was actually a meeting at Mar-a-Lago. Stop me if you get shocked here, okay? Trump had a meeting at Mar-a-Lago where he had the CEO of Marvel Entertainment, yes, the same people that brought you the Avengers movies and the Black Panther, that CEO, and 2 other folks who sat in the room, and they were actually writing up VA policy. And then the employees of the VA actually had to run their policy decisions through these 3 men, none of whom were veterans, none of whom have ever had healthcare experience or anything. Their goal is to break down these systems so that you lose faith. Our union marches about this. We fight about this all the time. Sometimes when you to explain the situation, you have to talk to people about what on the surface sounds like a very easy argument. The Concerned Veterans of America will say, oh, look, we just want to improve the VA. Well, you can improve the VA by hiring the amount of people necessary to improve the VA. And the only reason you haven't hired them is because your goal overall is to drive the agency into dysfunction so that you can privatize it out, chop it up amongst your wealthy friends, because that's guaranteed money. That's why I mentioned the libertarian phrase. What funds the VA are your tax dollars. That is an unending well of wealth and resources that they get to take from us and give to them. So whenever you hear conservatives talk about wealth redistribution, they try to use that terminology and aim it at us when we start talking about why are you making all this money and people are starving, when in reality, the greatest wealth redistribution system ever invented is the concept of privatization, because they take your tax dollars and they use them, your collected tax dollars, our collective tax dollars, shrink them, put it in a pile, and then they take 3 or 4 or 5 of their best friends and they divide the whole thing up. So in essence, they took the tax dollar you just spent, the one that you didn't get to spend, because Uncle Sam got theirs first, went to them, and then they divided up the way they see fit. They benefited from it. Our veterans received less service. And then the government has the more you contract out at that level, the less control you have over the end product or service that you deliver. So AFGE is not the worst. We suffer from fighting with them. We've been fighting privatization since I've been there for 24 years. But I know my brother from the Postal Service have the similar issues. They've been hamstringing the Postal Service for quite some time. And we saw it really come to a head over the last summer when we had all these terrible decisions made to slow down the mail service and everything else. And Mr. DeJoy, who's the postmaster, and we have a brother on from the postal workers who will go into it further and more with better stats than I have, but you can see the trend. So when you're on this webinar today, if you don't take anything else from this today, and there's been great information provided by brother CJ and brother Jeff. If you don't take anything else from this, understand this, that when you have public employees, such as myself, and we represent public employees, and same thing with my brother here, and like the discussion about the University of Arizona, your tax dollars should not be taken from you to be given to wealthy people to divide up simply so they can get wealthier at the expense of the service or good that that agency, that university, or the service or the postal service is to bring here to provide to you. So AFGE is long fought it. Hopefully when we're taking our days of action about these issues that you will join us in these fights, because at the end of the day, the people that we're fighting for the most are the veterans that we serve, who we have great respect for. We honor them, and really, I would tell you the truth, most of our employees love our veterans when they come through the door, because they themselves, 65, 70% of the people that work at the VA are veterans themselves. The Koch brothers and groups like them dress up these groups to look like they're grassroots, but in reality, they just get a lot of money, they make a lot of noise. And the only way you can fight money in politics is through organizing yourself into a block so big voter-wise that come election day, you're the one that's going to win the day. That's how you win elections. That's how you stop these groups, by having meetings like this, spreading this information, and then collectively moving to action to make sure that when it comes to time to elect people, we're electing folks who understand the dangers of dark money, understand the dangers of groups like the Koch brothers, and understand what their role is and how they can actually have the power to stop them. It lies within all of us, and I hope that when we get done with our presentation and everybody goes out there, you'll join up with CJ and Jeff and get busy, uncoke your workplace, right? And make sure that we get that element out of our processes, because it means that you're going to have favorites. Some people will get service, some people don't. Some people get this, some people don't. One of the biggest dangers of privatization is a private company's first responsibility is to its shareholders, first and foremost. The product is secondary. And that product meaning the service that I provide a veteran, the service I provide the postal office provides to you, it becomes secondary if the money is what they're more interested in. And the money is only interest to the 4 or 5 people who spend the investment in it. That's not what the government was set up to do, and it is fair. It's unfair to run that way. So we're standing in the breach, me, myself, other public unions, against these battles. And the Koch brothers are our #1 enemy, because they quietly fund all of these organizations and dress them up as if there's something that they're not. At the end of the day, the Concerned Veterans of America are about 2 or 3 people at the top of that position, the Koch monopoly, and their friends who give them money to make these things happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it back on over to Trish. So to introduce our next person.
Thank you so much, Brother Joe. I appreciate that. And I want to also thank everyone who's attending today. I know you all are working, taking this time out, but like you just heard from Brother Joe Diggs, this impacts us, right, at some level. It's our tax money, it's services that are provided to our veterans, it's, legislative agendas, and all of that takes from us, takes from the working, and gives money over back to a wealthy ruling class, right? We've been hearing a lot about this over the years, the 1%, the people who make the decisions. The best way for us to fight that is to organize. The best way for us to do anything about this is to come together, to be that stronger voting bloc. So I just thank you, Joe, for sharing with us, for giving us a perspective. Sometimes we don't, the VA system can sometimes be a mystery to a lot of folks on the outside. So I'm really just appreciative of you taking that time to kind of explain that and bring that knowledge and power to us. So thank
We
you.
appreciate the time, and I'm glad. Thank you for the time and the ability to express this, because, like you said, a lot of people are not aware of it, and they don't understand how insidious this dark money movement is and how much it impacts the policies that affect your life every day. If you're a veteran and you're on this webinar today, you've been impacted by the decisions made by 4 or 5 people. Some of them met at Mar-a-Lago in 2018. You can go on Google, you put in Mar-a-Lago VA, you'll see a list of articles about that meeting and what was wrong with that meeting and the reaction of the VA leadership to the policies that these 3 men were coming up with that had nothing to do with how to improve service for the veterans that they're supposed to help.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for sharing that with us. Okay, so up next we have we're going to speak in just a moment with Brother Michael Marconi from APWU. That's the Postal Workers Union. But CJ, if you can come in for us for just a few moments and talk a little bit about some of that history.
Okay,
that Koch influence.
I'll do that. Do we have that slide with the timeline of what's going on in the post office? Let's put that on if you can. Again, I'm not quite sure you can read it all, but I'll go over it. It basically shows what's been happening as far as the Koch organization and the post office over the last 40 or 50 years. So that chart starts out, let me just say first that the Kochs very early on in trying to implement their libertarian philosophy of getting rid of government, the Kochs targeted the US Postal Service as a prime candidate for privatization. So starting in 1970, the Kochs funded the Reason magazine. That was a magazine of the Libertarian Party. And they immediately published an article. It was called, "Why Not Laissez-Faire the Postal System?" or "Why Not Free Market the Postal System?" trying to raise awareness of their idea. In 1976, the Postal Service was added to, elimination of the Postal Service was added to the Libertarian Party's platform. And then in 1980, when David Koch was running for the vice president, as a libertarian, he publicized the idea of privatizing the post office. In 1987, Richard Fink, who was a longtime Koch associate with really an appropriate name, he was appointed to Ronald Reagan's privatization commission, which that commission urged privatization of the post office. In 1988, James Miller, another Koch functionary, was then director of Reagan's Management of Office and Budget, and he wrote a pro-privatization paper entitled "It's Time to Free the Mails." In 1989, that same James Miller, who was then a director of Charles Koch's Citizen for a Sound Economy, that was basically the precursor to Americans for Prosperity, he helped advance a book on privatizing the Postal Service. In 2002, the Postal Service transformation proposal that was issued by George Bush's appointee for Postmaster General mentioned privatization 156 times. 2003, James Miller again, he was approved to be on the Postal Service's Board of Governors by a Senate committee that was chaired by Susan Collins. 2006, James Miller again was named chairman of the Postal Service Board of Governors. In 2006, the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, which saddled the Postal Service with unprecedented debt, was passed by Congress after being pushed by James Miller, again with the help of Susan Collins. So that bill compelled the Postal Service to prepay the health and retirement benefits for all of its employees for 50 years in advance. At the time, Bloomberg News, not a liberal crowd, said that no other entity, public or private, has that requirement. It was also called one of the most insane laws that Congress has ever passed. The purpose of that bill was obviously an attempt by those wanting to privatize the post office to make the post office look like it was mired in debt, and should be privatized. So in 2009, ALEC, our American Legislative Exchange Council, begins pushing a bill to require military service member ballots to be carried only by profit-making corporations. In 2020, Koch's Americans for Prosperity singled out senators for special pressure to vote against the HEROES Act, and they specifically opposed using any of the funds in the HEROES Act to prevent the Postal Service bankruptcy. So they've had the Postal Service on target for a long time. And so let me turn it over now to Michael, who will talk about more of what's really been going on here at the ground level. So Michael?
Thank you, CJ. You kind of took a lot of the wind out of my sails, but a lot of that stuff I was going to cover. One of the main things that I found fascinating was the use of the word privatization. Was actually really brought to the light by the Koch brothers' father. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but with the magazine you're referring to, he kept using the term privatization, which prior to that had generally been a term that was used in Nazi-era Germany for basically doing what everybody here has been saying, where they take all the money from the people and divide it up amongst everybody else that they choose to do so. I'm trying to figure out, I don't want to be redundant. So the USPS has operated for more than 2 centuries with Benjamin Franklin as our first Postmaster General. We're older than the US itself, and a year before the Declaration of Independence for the United States. The colonial leaders wanted basically a way for the American people to communicate with one another without having to sacrifice lots of money to get stuff traveled around the country. They wanted to basically foster a reliable and affordable communication, and was a building block for the national democratic society that we have here today. After decades of attacks, though, from the Koch brothers and them basically chipping away at Congress, we've been under attack over the last 30 years or so, ever since we decided to unionize, and just right before that. So I'm going to talk about a couple other people that the Koch brothers, or I always call them the Koch brothers, but they're the Koch brothers. They basically try to do guises under the voice of the American taxpayer, or different things like that, and all these right-wing or libertarian columns that basically are saying how outraged American citizens are about the current state of the Postal Service. And so 2 of the foundations is the Heritage Foundation, which is one of them. They're a think tank for the far right, and they've made recommendations all the way from the NLRB head who was just fired, all the way to our Postmaster General on who to hire, when to hire them, and everything else. And Trump acted on several of their requests for those types of things. The second institute is the Cato Institute, which was originally named the Charles Koch Foundation. They pumped hundreds of millions of dollars into coffers to help get Cato's message out there, killing Social Security, federally subsidized school lunches, minimum wage, collective bargaining, and of course the unionized Postal Service. In 2009, the Cato Institute hired the powerful corporate lobbyist firm Pat Boggs to basically open the door for corporations to donate as much money as they wanted to political parties, basically being unchecked. Another Koch think tank is the State Policy Network. And recently, and I have a couple members, friends of mine in other states that this has happened to, they're basically right to work states that they do this in, but they put over $80 million to fund an anti-union campaign to basically get union members to opt out of their unions. Their main goal is basically to try to cause a 5 to 20% decline in membership, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in union dues. And then the secondary part of that is trying to force unions to spend money on political action campaigns. something that the U.S. Mail Not for Sale program started using. They've used keywords like union fat cat to describe presidents of unions and union reform to make their movement sound a little bit more catchy. SPN frames their arguments to union members as giving them the choice of who represents them at work, referring to them as workers of choice. They try to convince basically the union workers that the union's not working for them and they should have a say in what's going on. So basically, to sum everything up, starting in the 1980s with the Reagan administration, continuing today with the Trump administrations, the Koch Brothers and their affiliates, like the Heritage Foundation and the UPS, is a major partner with them as well, to draft blueprints for the budgets that do nothing but gut workers' rights, wages, benefits, and pensions. These publications influence members of Congress to draft a harmful 2018 budget that was worse than expected, hurting several of the federal workers and their families and providing tax cuts for the already incredibly wealthy. They also made sure to place key players from those foundations into places of influence. The blueprint for the White House budget was basically a think tank from the Heritage Foundation's blueprint for a balance of federal budget for 2017. The booklet called for lifting congressionally imposed restrictions on the closures of UPS processing centers and post offices, lifting restriction on delivery times and schedules, and permitting delivery of a 5-day work week or even less, eliminating service level mandates, and eliminating restrictions on complications in the postal business. So in layman's terms, most of these things are the current things being proposed by Louis DeJoy. We've already seen the attack on the postal processing centers, and Tucson's not shy to that either. In 2011, Tucson's plant was proposed to be closed and consolidated, sending everything up to Phoenix. Luckily, that didn't happen, but we still are on the chopping block, and it still can't happen. I know for the longest time they've been saying we should be a Monday through Friday delivery service, leaving weekends out. But there's lots of businesses that operate 7 days a week. So eliminating another day of service doesn't make any sense. But the biggest thing that they try to do is lose the faith in the Postal Service by the American people. That's the first step to the road to privatization. So they try to make us look bad and make us look like we're not doing a good job. Under DeJoy's reign so far, first class mail went from a 93% delivery as scheduled time down to, I think the last numbers that I saw were 47%. So this is a guy who's supposedly a expert in logistics. He owns businesses in logistics, competing companies with the Postal Service, and he can't get the mail from point A to point B, even though we've been doing it for hundreds of years with no problems. He was directly told to Trump to basically put in that position by one of the Koch Brothers think tanks, the Heritage Foundation. So a lot of the stuff that's happening with the post office stems from the Postal Reform Act that CJ was just talking about, that forces the Postal Service to pre-fund its retirees for 75 years in the future. It's an unprecedented mandate that nobody's ever had to do in federal industry or in private industry. The Postal Service was the #1 funder of their retirees prior to this happening, and we actually made the percentages for all federal agencies for retirees higher because of our money putting into there already. The Postal Service has a no carryover clause. For the longest time, whenever we made a profit, the money we either went back into the service or went directly to the government. So we've always been a cash cow, so to speak, for the government as well. But the main stuff that's been happening recently with DeJoy is a scary change. Tucson was scheduled to lose 5 processing machines here. They recently have backed off that a little bit and backed off the timeline of events if they're going to do anything with Tucson. But the biggest thing for me is the right-wing think tanks that the Koch brothers sponsor, donate money to, and basically empower. All of their goals seem to be evident everywhere you look. It's like they have these secret documents that nobody really knows about what they say, but then they turn up. But by the time they turn up, everything that's in them is already being put into play. It's unfortunate that I've worked at the post office for 16 years, and I've seen the steady decline in service, focusing on service and then focusing on eliminating jobs. trying to save money. And then we keep talking about stakeholders for the United States Postal Service. We're a service for the American people, just like the military, the fire department, or the police. Nobody says, you know, the military lost $75 billion last year. People say it costs that much to fund the military. But when they talk about the Postal Service, they don't want you to know that, only because it's more beneficial to them to make as much money as they possibly can if we were to privatize. And the 2017 Heritage Foundation recommendations end up turning into the 2018 Trump mandated inquisition into the Postal Service, and their, you know, his fight with Bezos over Amazon was really a way to open the door for more talks and fast forwarding the effort for privatization. Everything in there is available on the U.S. Treasury's website. Every other line basically says privatize, privatize, privatize. The cost of labor is too high. The cost of labor is like 70% of the total cost that the Postal Service endures. But in reality, we're actually making money hand over fist if it wasn't for that mandate. We've also had the issues with the NLRB making terrible decisions for workers' rights all over the country, basically trying to take away union time on the clock and several other things. The OSHA, we've been hesitant to refer anything that we have to either one of those two places because we didn't want to get negative rulings that are back to Tucson. So now that we hopefully have brighter days ahead, we're going to start attacking those avenues a little bit more with a little bit more ferocity. But basically, in closing, these days, Americans have more choices for express and package delivery than ever before, but only the U.S. Postal Service provides universal services free of area surcharges to everyone. 44% of zip codes where 43 million people live are subject to FedEx and UPS's extended surcharges. Basically, the farther away you live, the more money it costs you with FedEx and UPS. The post office, you can mail something from here to New York and it will cost you the same as mailing something from here to Phoenix, the same exact item. The highest fees apply to the deliveries in the most remote areas. So basically our rural areas, they charge you even more to deliver stuff out there. And the first step to privatizing also is basically taking all the cherry picking out. So all the most profitable routes will go quickly, and all the rural routes that cost more money to get mail out there will start to go away. And these people living in rural areas will have to travel to the town over, or maybe even the next city over, to get prescription drugs, their Social Security checks, many different items that they rely on. The Postal Service has been a staple in American communities for, like I said, hundreds of years. You can go to any major city in the U.S. and you'll see a post office basically in the middle of town. In Manhattan, for example, right across the street from the Big Bull, there's a huge post office, a really old building, probably worth millions of dollars for real estate, but is owned by the Postal Service. So we also have the real estate empire as well. But postal privatization would destroy a vital and truly democratic postal public service. This extensive centuries-old network helped build an American democracy and spread information and goods to every corner of our country. It has done so without discriminating in prices or service based on where people live and work, in order to provide everyone in the country with fair and equal services. The main message is our U.S. mail should not be for sale, and it's a service for our American people. And that's all I have, Trish. I'll leave it back to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate you sharing that with us today. And again, you know, this goes back to that same central theme, right? It's taking tax dollars, taking the resources of the working people of this country. And when we have basic fundamental services, right, things that are that justify the collection of those taxes, right? Our veteran services, our postal service, those things are part of why we pay taxes. So the idea of privatizing that so that it can essentially take food off your table to fund wealthy corporations, that's offensive as hell, to be perfectly honest. And, you know, everybody on this call, I know you work hard. Nobody should be taking a dime out of your pocket and putting it into the hands of a private corporation in that way. So thank you both for coming and talking to us. Everyone, actually, CJ, Jeff. We do have some questions from folks about Some are about how they can get more involved and plug in. And some, let's start with this one. What are some of the efforts at a federal level to undo the damage of bad policies pushed by the Koch Network and the far right over the years? Why don't we, Joe, why don't I have you start with that? We'll kind of go through and have everybody answer as it applies in their areas.
Well, one of the things that we did first off, once President Biden was sworn in and they had a transition team, a lot of unions, but I'm proud that our union was part of it, was on the transition team, and we set up listening tours where they could go around, talk to the employees to figure out what policy changes they made. President Biden came out the box with a couple really hot. He came out hot, man. I'll tell you, with the executive orders. Oh, sorry, I'm looking like Bubble. Hold on just a sec. There we go. There's my happy face. Okay, and so he came out of the box hot, and so we've been doing that. Again, one of the emphasis that we're placing with our members, and we're trying to reach out with our public and with our co-partners in these services, like the different veteran services groups and everything else, is we actually combine with them to put political pressure. Our belief, because we're a union and we're in the public sector, we're not able to strike. Our power comes from our ability to influence elections and influence policy. So we're going on really making a strong effort to build our mobilization capacity, as well as an outreach to the public so they understand what we're talking about and how it affects them. Basically, if you can make them see the connection between these bad policies and how it connects to them directly, it can overcome some of their natural partisanship, some of the identity politics that you have to overcome if you're going to get them to accept the truth and understand it. And really the concept, especially my libertarian friends who understand that once the government's taking, they can't stand the fact the government's taking any of their tax dollars. But the idea that you would take my hard-earned money that I earned, put it in a pot, and then you're giving it to 4 or 5 wealthy guys, I think people understand that concept. So those are some of the things we're putting the pressure on in the Congress, lobbying and everything else. But again, for us to have any impact, or really for anybody on this call, for you to have any impact on the policies that the government is making, you must be seen as a credible threat to the elected officials who are making the policies' ability to stay in the offices as they are. So at our union, we're really pushing the mobilization.
Great, thank you, Joe. Mike, would you speak to that a little bit? There is, you did talk a moment about the U.S. Postal Service Fairness Act, but some of the efforts at a federal level to save our postal service.
I just got an email from our national president. He just sent this out literally 3 hours ago. One of the main things they've been trying to do is campaigning for postal banking. The post office has ties all over the country, and we already have USPS money order transactions that take place, but actually having check cashing services offered by the Postal Service, or wiring money from the U.S. to another country. The post office is probably the most intertwined U.S. agency with other countries due to the mailing system. So that's one of the things they're pushing for. The second one was for Biden to name more council members to the board of, I keep losing my train of thought here, for the House panel to basically nominate new people to take on the 7-member panel currently of the Postmaster General and then the Board of Delegates. I can't even think of their name off the top of my head. I apologize, but I just got this email, like I said. Postal Service is, Biden's going to nominate Ron Stroman. Postal Service has recently retired Deputy Postmaster General Amber McReynolds, the Chief Executive of National Vote at Home Institute, and Aitan Hajar, the former General Counsel of the American Postal Workers Union. So he's putting people into place to hopefully get voted out Louis DeJoy, because he was appointed and he does have a term. He cannot be fired. He needs to be voted out. With those appointment shifts, we'll have a 6-4 margin in theory of people who would vote to remove DeJoy. If there's a deadlock or a gridlock 5-5, then DeJoy casts the deciding vote on stuff like that. But we've been canvassing super like all over the country, trying to get our members to know that they have workers' rights. It seems as though, I mean, people nowadays, the younger kids, I'm only 40 myself, but I sound like an older person, I guess, but the younger folks don't seem to know a whole lot about unions. One of the things I've taken on here locally is try to educate everybody I possibly can that I come in contact with, my kids' friends, other parents, and anybody, just of the labor struggle. You know, you get the whole, you know, welfare this, welfare that, and I always tell them, you know, if you guys really feel that way about welfare, you know who could end welfare? Nabisco. Nabisco could say, I'm going to stop taking the government's money for my products. Pepsi could say, I'm going to stop taking money for those products. Welfare, all the stuff you're complaining about welfare would go away immediately. And then they talk about the cell phones and stuff like that. The people who are actually receiving these products aren't the ones benefiting. Corporations are. Somebody has that contract with the government for cell phones. You know, somebody's benefiting off of that, and it's not the person receiving the cell phone or any of the other government subsidized things that we offer. But it's just amazing how uplifting of a feeling it is when you tell somebody, I got your back. You know, you don't have to worry about supervisors harassing you. You don't have to worry about these things because we're in this together. And I may not be able to help you every single time, but I guarantee you, if you call me, I'll answer. And that's kind of the message I think that we need to reestablish with unions, is trying to focus on our younger people, because these school systems have been teaching the opposite of what unions are for decades now. I wasn't taught a whole lot about unions when I was in school. My mom taught me everything I know. And then just coming up through the Postal Service and educating myself. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to hear other unionist and pro-union people in Tucson especially that support labor, because it's a very important thing, and it's literally the foundation to our society. Unions built this country, and unions are still strong. We just need to reevaluate how we're approaching things, and we also need to remind these people that are doing all these negative things to us that we still do hold power.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. And, you know, that just to what you were saying, I'm just going to throw this out there now while we're on the subject. This is the first in a series of events that we're going to be holding. So keep an eye out, folks. We're going to be having, you know, how do I join a union? How do I organize my workplace? What does it mean, right? Because like you said, we are in Arizona. We're in a state where there hasn't been a lot of conversation. So we're going to start doing things to bring those conversations to people. And so I just want to extend that invitation to everybody just right now. This is the beginning, but we're going to go through and our end goal is to hopefully empower, give education, bring people together, because the workers in Arizona have been under the thumb of the bosses for a long time. And it's time for us all to come together more than ever, and help people try to take that control and take their power, right, in the workplace. We do have a few other questions. Let me take a look here. And the next question is, how do we uncoke campuses, especially when some campus jobs and research rely on bringing in outside sources of funding? CJ or Jeff, I'll let one of you take that.
Why don't you grab that, Jeff? Yeah.
I can try to address that. First consideration is it's incredibly difficult. Universities are money machines. And one of our professors may do a better job answering that than I can, but I will attempt to field the question. It's not just that money comes to other centers and associated organizations that exist on campus. There are a number of them. You know, our public university and more public universities have many associated centers and think tanks and research institutes that are set up and solicit a lot of private donations, you know. But there's a difference. They don't, for the most part, interfere actively with the administration, the rightful process of selecting faculty, of academic impartiality and integrity, of parlaying state funding to do the bidding of the donors. This is something that we are finding uniquely I believe, uniquely with the Koch think tank network. How do we fight them when funding comes? In our case, in this state, the funding is coming from the legislature now. They left the legislature on the hook. They originally promised that the center would be self-sustaining, that it would have its own funding from its own billionaire network of yahoos. But that, in fact, has turned out not to be the case. And what's going on here now is that our state money is going into the coffers to propagandize our state kids here in Arizona at our schools, as Brother Marconi mentioned, not learning what we should be learning in our schools. And in fact, kids learning what they shouldn't be. I have more to say later, if there's a chance. But in terms of fighting on the funding leveraging mechanisms, it's an incredibly difficult battle, especially with the think tanks that our affiliate organization, Unquote My Campus nationally, is fighting. Places like the Mercatus Center, which didn't get mentioned yet today, very prominent think tank with funding to the tune of what is $100 million or something like that. Vast policy implications that just stream out of that center. Everything that we're talking about today, recommending, privatization, on and on down the line. So when it's private money, it's hard to fight. But here in Arizona, in a way, we're lucky because locally, our legislature is funding these suckers, these tentacles. And as Brother Joe was talking about, we have some leverage there. And we're trying to work to exert it. So that's my answer to that question at this point.
Thank you so much, Jeff. All right, we've got another one here. Mike, it looks like you were going to take this one. The question is, when Charles Koch dies, who will take his place within the network? Who are his consigliaries?
I just recently read on this. I can't remember where I saw it. There's actually two heirs. One of them is a writer, which is the niece of the still alive Koch brother. Then the other one's the nephew. His name is Chase. They just recently named him as heir to everything. So I don't know if the sister's going to be involved at all, but he's very quiet. He's 42 years of age, and I've never heard of him outside of this article. But he's basically a huge Republican donor behind the scenes. He's obviously exceedingly wealthy, and it's just that we all know the struggles of dealing with Republicans only because we all live in Arizona, which was forever, recently turned blue, but several of my members are constantly telling me how terrible it is. The unions and the stuff that we push is all Democrat agenda. And I try to show them, look at, neither party may be doing much to help us, but I can guarantee you the Democrat Party is not doing a lot to hurt us. The Republican Party always seems to go after the post office. We're always like in their sights. As soon as they get in office, they accelerate everything. So I just try to show them, the NLRB, for example, the person that was put there by Trump, and he's a lawyer who specializes in destroying collective bargaining agreements. How is that a fair and just person to have there? So as far as I know, it's going to be Chase Koch. It's the nephew of whatever brother is still alive.
I could just add one comment about who might succeed Charles. Jane Meyer mentioned that in her webinar the other day, and she said the other people who might be in line, none of them have the capability or the personality that Charles Koch has. So she doesn't know what's going to happen, but she thinks that when Charles does die, which might be soon, that they're certainly going to lose an awful lot of their power.
Okay, thank you, CJ. Appreciate that. I think like what we've got on questions. Mike, maybe you can there's one last question here. The question is, why are the Democrats in Congress backing off on getting rid of DeJoy and working with him? Maybe you can kind of explain how that works a little bit better for us.
The only things I've been told is, like I said, he can't be just kicked out. There has to be a vote. We didn't have a full board of governors. That was the word I was struggling with earlier. Board of governors. We now have a full board with these appointments by Biden. So one of the commitments that I know our national president wanted to get from Biden was the fact that he would fill these vacancies if elected as soon as possible. And it looks like they've been having House committee meetings all day today and yesterday. And that pressure, along with everything else, Biden did name those people. So with that, hopefully, I'm assuming, being a negotiator myself, if you know you can't get rid of somebody, you have to find common ground with them to try to work with them. So I'm assuming that was what it was about, because you can't just say, screw you, I'm not going to listen to you. So hopefully that's what the Democrats were pushing for with discussions with DeJoy. But he's a very interesting person. There's like internal documents in the Postal Service. All the changes he wanted to make, the biggest problem that the Office of the Inspector General found was it was all verbal. There was no written orders on what was supposed to be done, so it caused chaos amongst the ranks. All these supervisors were running around off of a verbal instruction from a verbal instruction from a verbal instruction, which led to breakdowns everywhere, but it basically takes the blood off of his hands, so to speak, because nobody can point the finger back to him and why he's doing it. So hopefully, at the very, very least, we'll get some accountability of why these decisions were made.
Great, thanks, Mike. Okay, that looks like that's all the questions that we have. I just want to point out really what we see as a common theme here, which is a very intentional and well-funded and well-orchestrated attempt to make our public services dysfunctional and ultimately to privatize them, right? If it's at the VA hospitals, and I can tell you my mom was a VA nurse for a long time, I've never seen a more caring group of people in medicine than the folks at the VA. Lots of volunteers, lots of people just there because they care about what they do. And that there's 49,000, I believe you said, Joe, 49,000 positions that haven't been filled, right?
Right.
You can't talk about, we can't get appointments, the services aren't being provided when you intentionally leave 49,000 jobs vacant. Not only are you harming our economy, but you're harming the ability to provide a service to veterans who more than deserve it. And when we look at the Postal Service, when you were talking, Mike, about DeJoy and first class mail delivery, going from a 98% on-time delivery down to a 47%, did you say, on the on-time delivery, right? You've got somebody in charge who owns logistics companies, who has a vested interest in seeing that system destabilized and fall apart. That's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. That's what we really want everybody to kind of take home today, is this is intentional. There's a lot of money and a lot of funding in this, and it's being done by very wealthy people who just want to get wealthier, right? There's no concern for you. There's no concern for the public. So I hope that shed a little light on some things for everybody today. Jeff, if I can ask you though to take a few minutes and let people kind of know about Kochs Off Campus and your work and how they can join in the fight.
I'm ready to do that, Trish.
Great.
Okay, I would like to start, yes, Kochs Off Campus, our work and how you can join us, but I left off with the Freedom Center, so I'm just going to briefly describe again what they are. The Freedom Center was started in 2008 with millions of dollars from Charles Koch's Foundation and his allies. And it built on a program that existed at the university amongst some rather libertarian professors called the Freedom Program. Since 2014, the state legislature has subsidized the Freedom Center with millions, actually between the three centers, tens of millions in Arizona tax money, which they get to keep. It's not like what Brother Michael said about the post office and what it has to do with its funding. It sits there in the bank for them. And even though, as I said, they promised they'd support themselves, they continue to take state money. Why are we letting them get away with this? The Freedom Center is on the record as a right-wing libertarian think tank in the network of Koch think tanks in that genre. There's about 350 of them nationwide at universities. It is distorting education to fit its ideology. It recruits students to advance its agenda, and it has weaseled into faculty hiring, which mucks up academic integrity. The FC Freedom Center is well positioned now to infiltrate, undermine, and even ultimately advance the destruction of public education in Arizona. Keyword, privatize. So now to Kochs Off Campus. We stand against the center, especially against the use of public money for the freedom schools at all of our universities. Billionaires certainly do not need our help spreading their PR. We partner with a national organization, Unquote My Campus. And I just want to list a few of our accomplishments so that you can see the work. We have demanded and received public records about the university and exposing the Freedom Center, connecting the dots, and revealing an organization that operates in bad faith. We continue to demand records, with the latest having just been obtained this week under threat of a lawsuit after untimely delay. About 2 years, our public university was delaying a Freedom of Information public records request until actually they got a letter that delineated from Terry Goddard that something might come their way in the form of a lawsuit. Public records appeared. There's a course that they designed with Templeton money that was in our high schools at the TUSD and at AMPHI. And it was a course that was extremely libertarian in its ideology. We got that kicked out. UA had originally set up a review for the Freedom Center when it was instituted, and they were kicking that can down the road. We compelled them to conduct a review, although ultimately more review and more objective review is needed. We have the Arizona Democratic Caucus now in the legislature, in theory, agreeing to zero out funding for the centers in the future. So while my union can't be partisan and our unions can't be partisan, they can work on our behalf and appear willing to do so. We have circulated a petition and received over 100 faculty signatures against the Freedom Center. We have brought the issue of the Freedom Center to the floor of the UA Faculty Senate on multiple occasions. We work with and present at forums with Outlaw Dirty Money, Save Our Schools Arizona, Save Our VA, Jobs with Justice, and more. We have an assertive presence in any media that will have us. And you can visit the news page on our website to see a lot of the reporting that has taken place about our campaigns. Also, you can visit the website for more about the FOIAs, the economic propaganda course that I was talking about in the high schools. There's an awful lot about our work to discredit that course, you can see. It was a very interesting campaign. And when you go to that website, perhaps Trish, you can put up some of that information now. When you go to that website, you can use the link to contact us and get involved with our work. We meet every other week. I have more to say. Just a reminder and a wrap up, because I knew this was the last part of the webinar. Remember, the Kochs have been at this for over 40 years. We have not. We have much organizing to do. We can't underestimate this enemy. And while Koch may take his logistical genius to the grave with him, we can't count on that. Their influence machine is the biggest, baddest, and best organized thing on the right, period. It's better diversified and better funded than anyone else's. Their donor network is, as CJ pointed out, equivalent to a political party, the same scale. They've mounted a nationwide assault on ordinary people, workers, and democratic institutions, and people must mount a coordinated nationwide resistance. They intend to privatize here, education, public education. They want to privatize it. As you know, they've had great success here in Arizona. We've all been witness to the campaigns. Koch and the Bradley Foundation from my hometown originally came up with vouchers, ESA, public choice, quote unquote, initiatives that serve to starve public education, which we all know this. Pell Grants, they blocked refinancing of them, pushed through deep cuts. They pushed through cuts in state funding of public education, creating overcrowded and under-resourced classrooms, as well as spiraling into tuition increases at the colleges, which makes them resented and unaffordable and dysfunctional. As was pointed out, this is the agency rot that is intentional by design. They attack Teachers' unions, their legislative and judicial friends, are behind continuing efforts to crush teachers and public education here in Arizona. The same network has planted hundreds of academic centers, as has been mentioned. They are on all 3 campuses here. These centers serve to steal the prestige of public universities and hide behind their logos and clout to push their ideological quote unquote research, which we've discussed. And you see people like DeJoy and others calling it research to further their goals of privatization. The Freedom Center at the UA created the disastrous high school textbook and course indoctrinating students in freedom economics. And we've talked about how this is anti-worker, anti-union, anti-minimum wage, anti-public sector. In Arizona and in Mexico, this course has been presented. Their scholars work overtime, producing papers that shred every aspect of the public good in favor of a deregulated, privatized world. A slew of obnoxious bills emanating from their toadies at the Arizona legislature bears out this claim. We've been watching this session and we can see it. Kochs Off Campus has fought all of this tooth and nail. We ran the Freedom Center's high school course out of TUSD and got it canceled. So there's some kids that are not hearing this claptrap. They're getting a straight up education in economics, hopefully. Labor unions, getting to the end, folks. Koch hates unions. We've said this because they stand between workers and raw corporate power. The Freedom Center is well positioned to produce anti-union policy in Arizona and promulgates those views 365 days a year. Their model and goal goes much further, as CJ pointed out, than they have so far achieved. They didn't stop with Wisconsin. Arizona is leading the pack. Again, bills we see up for consideration here in Arizona bear this out. We are working to link legislatures to donor summits, the Freedom Center and ALEC. This is work that we are engaged in. The social contract, briefly, we know they have worked to roll back the New Deal, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They want to destroy the Affordable Care Act. It taxes the wealthy. Unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and so forth. Arizona, as we know, has some of the worst provisions in the country. This is no coincidence. This gang has been hard at work here all along. Public health has not been mentioned, but public health is certainly important in a pandemic. The Kochs have been showing up on the wrong side of the issue of public health and dealing with the pandemic. They have pushed to privatize all R&D public health and make it market driven. Ducey's passivity in the face of COVID is in line with the Koch philosophy. He is a product of, as they continue to fund the propaganda think tanks at our schools. Courts, we've talked a little bit about, they co-opt the judiciary from every end, from curating and schooling the judges at these think tanks to providing lists for nominees, as has been discussed, to make sure politicians are in place to do their bidding with the nominations. This is especially true on the federal judiciary, getting judges who subscribe to Koch's ideology in place. The Federalist Society has replaced the American Bar Association as a source of recommendations for appointments to the bench. They work hand in glove with the Kochs. State level judiciaries also. In 2018, in Arizona, the Supreme Court quashed Invest in Ed and outlaw dirty money initiatives, despite strong support from state residents. This is not a single campaign. This is not a single ballot initiative. This is fighting against a well-established machine that crushes these things decade after decade. The Koch operative Ducey expanded and packed our court with hand-picked appointees. The court's decisions were horrible. That's no surprise. Environment, as we know briefly, anti-regulation of all kinds of environmental dangers is par for the course. And the Kochs were among the first and the most powerful voices in the climate misinformation campaign, which all these negative and positive feedback synergies, you're looking at the Postal Service trying to obtain an electric fleet of vehicles, that's against the oil interests of the Kochs, not to mention the interests of hobbling the Postal Service. Finally, they're anti-democratic. They are in the position of acting to suppress the vote and destroy democracy. Freedom Center here in Tucson had an acolyte, a protege of Professor David Schmitz, who is the director of the Freedom Center. cue the Batman villain theme, but he wrote a book called Against Democracy. It has been presented. Its ideas have been taught. This group of people, they don't have anything but contempt for the power of ordinary people voting and participating. This thinking is used to justify the voter suppression laws and other maneuvers that we see to hinder the popular will. So I hope that you can see that the Freedom Center right here in Tucson is part and parcel of the machine that the Koch brothers have erected across this nation. I'm so grateful for CJ's incredible presentation and for the Union brothers and sisters who are here. And we need more talent. We need more boots on the ground. Everybody in KOC is extended as far as we can be with our work. And we would love to have more people join us. So you can go, Trish, I don't know if you still have that slide, but it's to our website at kochsoffcampus.org. Yes, right here. And you can see us on Facebook or mail us at Gmail. You can contact us through the website. Trish, could you back up one slide? There was a recommended reading list. This you can see on our website too. These are 4 books. Some have been quoted, some have been not. Highly recommend Kochland, as it really gives you an eye and ear into the mentality of the Koch organization, how it has been so effective. At any rate, you can visit our website and get this recommended reading, as well as other webinars that we have been part of and presented, and contact us. Thank you for your patience listening to me talk about all of this and Kochs Off Campus. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate that wealth of information there, and helping people better understand how they can get involved. I want to take a moment and thank all of our panelists today. We did, oh, you know what? We did have one more thing. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Give me just half a second here to switch over. Michael Marconi from APWU, you had an update, a local update for us.
So one last thing I wanted to bring to everybody's attention, and I'm posting the
Gotta unmute yourself, Michael. You're muted.
that might help, right? Okay, so I just posted the link to what I'm referring to with the help of several of the panelists that are on today, AFL-CIO, Jobs for Justice, lots of people helped with this movement. But when we found out that the Tucson plant was planning on removing 4 machines, I started thinking of the consolidation list again and everything else. I started reaching out to the mayor and everybody else who would possibly listen. And with the help of Stephen Valencia, who I didn't see on here today, we were able to set up meetings with the mayor, council member Fimbris, and several other members of city council. And they put on the TucsonArizona.gov website a format for people who live in Tucson, have lived in Tucson, small business owners, anybody who lives in this region, to submit a statement, an article, anything that you would like about how important your belief is in the Postal Service here locally and the effects of the removal of Cherrybell's processing facility would have on our region. But that's all I wanted to add. I promise, Trish, I'd keep it brief. So that's the, if you guys are interested, that's the link there in the chat line. And then if you go to, I think it's the Democratic, trying to think of the name of the Facebook page. Most of the people here are members of it. Let me find it real quick. I apologize. Pima County Democratic Party. It's on their Facebook page as well.
Michael, I just tried the link and it's not coming up as a working page right now.
Sorry.
Well,
Well, that's not good.
We're going to send out some information to everybody too, as a follow-up on this, with some links and more information, so we can always we can do that as
Well, that's the link that's on the form.
Oh, you got muted again somehow.
I don't know what's going on. My computer's getting tired of me talking, I guess. It's muting me on its own. Either way, if that's the bad link, I know for sure that's on their flyer that they were handing out, but the TucsonArizona.gov, you should be able to find it on there relatively easy by searching for Protect Cherryville on their search spot. I've already submitted a couple different ones. Tell your family members, tell anybody who's interested. We're preparing for the possibility of talks again of consolidation, so we can be ready with testimony from the citizens of Tucson.
Good deal. All right, thanks, Mike. I do want to give everybody just a quick update too on some things that to keep an eye out for. As we've talked about today, there is one of the ways you can get involved in working towards legislative measures, rather bills and whatnot that are helpful versus harmful, right? We've talked a lot about that today, about there being agendas in place and things moving through at a federal level. We also see this at a state level. In some instances, you see these same types of agendas at county or city level. So we're going to be offering some training in the coming months. Well, I shouldn't say coming months, probably coming weeks. So keep an eye out for requests to speak. And if you're unfamiliar with that, what it is, it's a mechanism so that constituents can weigh in on particular pieces of legislation, right? There's bills that pass through the House and the Senate, and it allows you to just weigh in for or against the bill if you like, or you have the option to leave comments if it's on an agenda, or you can request to speak in front of the legislature and explain your position. So that can be a tricky thing to navigate. People seem to be kind of intimidated by it. It's actually really easy, super simple to use. It takes a little bit to get registered, but we're going to be offering some training to help everybody be able to use that. We're going to also have coming up Civics 101, right? Everybody had a little bit of civics in school, but sometimes, 20 years down the road, you've been working, maybe you haven't thought about it that much. So we want to make that accessible, right? Another way for you to exercise your voice and use your power. We've got up on the screen for the Pima Area Labor Federation, more commonly known in the community as PALF, our website, our phone number, and the email address for our field director, Ryan Kelly, who's been real patient with us today. Thanks, Ryan, for helping us get all this going and together, behind the scenes guy. So there's that information. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions, if you want to know how you can get involved, if you want to be in contact with any of the organizations today. We're happy to do that. If you have questions about, like I said, we want to do some trainings coming up about how do I organize my workplace, how do I join a union, any of those sort of things. If it's a labor related question, we're happy to try and answer it or find the answer for you if we don't know it. So again, I just want to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you for giving of your time and your resources and your knowledge, and sharing that with us. It's you've imparted a pretty incredible gift on the community. And so I just want to express my thanks. And thank you for all the work that you do every day on behalf of your membership. That's not an easy task. And it's a lot more work and a lot more hours than I think anybody who hasn't done it knows. So thank you both for that. Okay, well with that, thanks everybody. Thanks to Kochs Off Campus for joining us and for all of our attendees today. I hope everybody has a great evening, and we'll be following up with you soon. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.